Welcome to the store. Don't forget to subscribe, and support me.
The air was thick with ash, and the once vibrant forests of the continent had long since given way to barren wastelands. The skies were perpetually dark, not from the coming of night, but from the black clouds of dragonfire that seemed to hang endlessly over the world. Alan had seen the sun only a few times in his life, and each time it felt like a distant memory, a relic of a time before the dragons came. That he crouched behind a ridge, eyes scanning the desolate plain below. His hand rested lightly on the hilt of his sword, though he knew the blade would be useless against the creatures that now ruled the land. The dragons, massive and impenetrable, moved freely across the scorched earth, their scales glinting in what little light broke through the clouds. Humans had become nothing more than prey, scattered, broken, and hiding in the shadows of what once was. Alan had been a child when they first descended from the mountains. He remembered the stories told in hushed voices, stories of ancient times when dragons were nothing more than myths. But the myths had become real, and with them came the end of human dominion. His village was among the first to fall, razed to the ground in a single night by a firestorm from above. The flames had claimed his parents, his friends, everything he had ever known. Now, 10 years later, Alan was one of the few left who still resisted. Most of humanity had resigned themselves to a life of fear and servitude, hiding in caves, scavenging for scraps, and hoping the dragons would overlook them. But not Alan. He had sworn to fight, even if it meant dying alone in the process. Today, however, something felt different. As he crouched behind the ridge, watching the movements of the dragon that patrolled the area, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His instincts had kept him alive this long, and they were screaming at him to move. Slowly, he shifted his position, keeping low as he crept along the edge of the ridge, careful not to make any noise. It was then that he saw it, a glint of metal buried in the ground just ahead. At first, he thought it was a piece of debris, some remnant from a long-forgotten battle. But as he approached, something about it drew him in. The metal was old, ancient even, and as his fingers brushed against its surface, he felt a strange warmth radiating from it. Carefully, he dug around the object until he could free it from the dirt. What he unearthed was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was a weapon, though not like any sword or spear he had ever encountered. Its design was intricate, almost otherworldly, with patterns carved into the blade that seemed to shimmer with a faint, pulsing light. The hilt was smooth and cool to the touch, and when he lifted it, the weapon felt impossibly light in his hand. For a moment, Alan simply stared at it, his mind racing. There had been whispers among the survivors, rumors of ancient weapons hidden deep within the earth, weapons that could pierce even dragon scales. But those were just stories, passed down by the few elders who still remembered the time before the dragons. Could this be one of them? A roar echoed across the plain, shaking Alan from his thoughts. The dragon had sensed him. Its massive wings beat the air as it took to the sky, circling overhead. Alan's heart raced as he clutched the weapon, feeling the weight of it in his hand. He had no time to think, only to act. The dragon descended, its eyes locked on him, flames curling from its nostrils. Alan braced himself, gripping the weapon tightly as the beast swooped down, jaws wide and ready to strike. In that moment, something surged through him, a power he couldn't explain, as if the weapon itself was guiding him. He raised the blade and, with a single swift motion, slashed at the dragon as it closed in. The weapon sliced through the dragon's scales as if they were nothing more than cloth. The beast let out a deafening screech, its massive body crashing to the ground in a heap. Alan stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. He had done it. He had killed a dragon, something no human had ever managed to do in the years since their reign began. the realization hit him like a wave. This weapon, it wasn't just a relic. It was a key. A key to humanity's survival. Word of the dragon's death spread quickly, carried by whispers among the scattered survivors. At first, many refused to believe it. How could a single man, armed with nothing more than an old sword, have slain one of the beasts that had ruled over them for so long? But when Alan arrived at the hidden settlement nestled deep within the mountains, dragging the head of the dragon behind him, there was no denying the truth. The settlement was a grim place, filled with the hollow-eyed remnants of what was once a proud people. They had built their homes into the rocky cliffs, carving out a meager existence in the shadow of constant fear. As Alan approached the gates, the guards stared at him in disbelief, their hands gripping their spears as if unsure whether to let him in. "It's true, then," one of the guards muttered, eyes wide as he took in the sight of the dragon's head. You killed it." Alan nodded, his expression grim. "We can win," he said simply, though the weight of those words hung heavy in the air. The leader of the settlement, an older man named Dane, met Alan in the central hall. Dane had once been a military strategist, back when humanity still had armies to command. Now, he led the survivors, though even he had given up hope of ever turning the tide against the dragons. "You're telling me there's a way to kill them?" Dane asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. Alan placed the ancient weapon on the table between them. "This can cut through their scales," he said. "I've seen it with my own eyes. We just need to use it right." Dane leaned forward, studying the weapon. "Even if what you're saying is true, one weapon isn't going to be enough. There are hundreds of dragons out there. Thousands, even. And they have us outnumbered." "We don't need to fight all of them," Alan replied. "Just the leaders. Take them out, and the rest will fall." Dane was silent for a moment, his fingers drumming against the table as he considered Alan's words. Finally, he looked up, his eyes hard. "We'll need more than just a weapon. We'll need a plan." In the days that followed, Alan and Dane worked together to form a strategy. They knew they couldn't simply charge into battle. The dragons were too powerful, and their forces too vast. Instead, they would have to rely on stealth and cunning, using guerrilla tactics to weaken the dragons' hold on the land while they built up their strength. Word spread quickly, and soon others began to join them, those who had once thought all hope was lost, now drawn by the promise of a way to fight back. Among them was Kara, a skilled archer who had lost her entire village to dragon fire. She had been living alone in the wilderness, surviving off the land, but when she heard of Alan's victory, she knew she had to join the cause. There was also Leora, a healer who had spent years studying the ancient texts that spoke of the dragons and their weaknesses. It was she who first recognized the weapon Alan had found for what it truly was, a relic from a time when humans and dragons had fought side by side, before the dragons had turned on their former allies and seized control. "The weapon isn't just a sword," Leora explained one night as they gathered around the fire. "It's a symbol. It was forged in a time when humans and dragons were equals, when there was balance between us. That balance was broken, but the weapon still holds the power to restore it." Alan listened intently, though he found it hard to believe. "You're saying this sword can bring peace between us and the dragons?" Leora shook her head. "No. But it can give us the chance to fight back, to take our place in the world again. The dragons will never let us live in peace. But with this, we can at least make them fear us." The first strike came at dawn. Alan, Kara, and a small group of survivors crept through the forest under the cover of darkness, their target a dragon that had made its nest in the ruins of an old castle. The plan was simple: used the element of surprise to take down the dragon before it could call for reinforcements. As they approached the castle, Alan's heart raced. He could hear the dragon's deep, rumbling breaths echoing through the crumbling stone walls. This was no young dragon, it was old, powerful, and wise to the tricks of humans. Alan crouched low, his grip tight on the ancient weapon as he scanned the castle's crumbling walls. The structure had once stood proud, a symbol of human strength. Now, like so much of the world, it had been reduced to little more than ruins, yet the dragon nested here, surrounded by the bones of its past conquests. A cold wind swept through the gaps in the stone, carrying with it the faint smell of sulfur. Kara moved silently beside him, her bow ready, an arrow nocked. Behind them, the rest of the group waited, tense and silent, hearts pounding in unison. They had one shot at this. One chance to take the dragon down before it summoned the others. Alan gave a sharp nod, and they moved as one. Kara slipped ahead, using the cover of the fallen stones to find her vantage point. Alan could feel the tension in the air, the fear, but also the hope, the desperate belief that this plan could work, that they might actually survive this fight. He pushed those thoughts aside, focusing only on the task ahead. They couldn't afford doubt. Not now. The dragon lay just beyond the castle's courtyard, a massive, coiled beast, its scales a dull black that blended with the shadows. Its eyes were closed, its breaths deep and even, though Alan knew better than to assume it was asleep. Dragons never truly rested. Their instincts were sharp, their senses attuned to even the slightest disturbance. Alan moved closer, careful to avoid the rubble underfoot. Each step felt like a gamble, each shift of the air like a signal that might wake the dragon. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the ancient weapon in his hand both comforting and terrifying. They were so close now. The dragon's head lay on its massive forearms, its nostrils flaring slightly as it breathed. Alan could see the faint shimmer of its scales, knew the weapon would have to strike perfectly to pierce them. In the distance, Kara's bow twanged, the arrow whistling through the air. It struck the dragon's flank, embedding itself deep between two scales, and the creature roared in fury. The sound shook the earth, and Alan surged forward, weapon raised, the blade gleaming as it caught the faint light filtering through the clouds. The dragon's eyes snapped open, its massive head swinging toward Alan, teeth bared in a snarl. Time seemed to slow as Alan charged, his mind focused on the single point where he would strike. The dragon reared up, wings spreading wide, its roar deafening as it prepared to unleash its fiery breath. But Alan was faster. With a shout, he brought the blade down with all his strength, aiming for the vulnerable spot between the dragon's neck and chest. The ancient weapon sliced through the scales like they were paper, sinking deep into the dragon's flesh. The beast let out a guttural scream, thrashing wildly as Alan yanked the blade free, blood pouring from the wound. It staggered, its wings flapping in a desperate attempt to take flight, but it was too late. The damage was done, the dragon collapsed to the ground, its body convulsing as its life drained away. Alan stood over it, chest heaving, the weapon still clutched tightly in his hand. Around him, the rest of the group emerged from their hiding places, wide-eyed and breathless. They had done it. Another dragon had fallen, but there was no time to celebrate. Already, Alan could hear the distant roars of other dragons, their cries of fury and grief echoing across the plains. They knew what had happened. They would come. We need to move, Alan said, wiping the sweat from his brow. Now. Kara nodded, her face pale but determined. How long do you think we have? Not long enough, Alan replied grimly, glancing back at the fallen dragon. Its body was massive, larger than any they had faced before, and it would only be a matter of time before the others descended upon them. They fled the castle, leaving the dragon's body behind as a grim message to the rest of the beasts. The others had felt invincible for so long, but now they would know that humans were no longer prey. They were fighters. For weeks, the resistance continued their guerrilla warfare, striking at dragons in the dead of night, taking down the leaders one by one. Each victory was costly, and with every battle, they lost more of their own. But the survivors were fueled by a purpose greater than any one life. They were fighting not just for themselves, but for the survival of the human race. Dane, ever the strategist, devised new plans for each strike, using the element of surprise to their advantage. They learned how to move swiftly and quietly, how to evade the dragon's keen senses, and how to use the terrain to their advantage. Alan's weapon became a symbol of hope, a relic that reminded them all of what they were fighting for. Leora continued to study its origins, uncovering more of its history with each passing day. The weapon was made for this, she told Alan one night as they sat by the fire, the rest of the group asleep around them. It was forged to restore balance, to bring down the dragons when they became too powerful. It was never meant to be used by one man alone. Alan stared into the flames, the weight of her words heavy on his shoulders. "Then why me?" he asked quietly. "Why now?" Leora smiled sadly. "Because you were the one who found it. And because you believe in something greater than yourself." The truth of her words settled over him like a shroud. He hadn't asked for this responsibility, but it had found him nonetheless. And now, as the resistance grew, as more survivors joined their cause, Alan knew there was no turning back. They were all that stood between humanity and extinction. The final battle came sooner than any of them had expected. The dragons, enraged by the losses they had suffered, launched a full-scale assault on the remaining human strongholds. The skies were filled with fire and fury as the beasts descended upon them, determined to crush the last vestiges of human resistance. Alan and his group took up their positions on the cliffs overlooking the battlefield, their hearts pounding in their chests. This was it. The final stand. If they failed here, humanity would fall, but Alan refused to let that happen. He tightened his grip on the ancient weapon, feeling its power thrumming beneath his fingertips. They had come too far, sacrificed too much, to give up now. The first wave of dragons hit with the force of a hurricane, their massive bodies crashing into the cliffs, sending rocks tumbling down into the valley below. Fire roared through the air, scorching the earth as the beasts unleashed their fury. But the resistance was ready. Arrows flew from every direction, striking the dragons with precision and force. Kara's arrows, tipped with the same metal as Alan's weapon, found their marks between the scales of the beasts, and one by one, the dragons fell from the sky, their massive bodies crashing into the earth below. But it wasn't enough. There were too many. Alan fought his way through the chaos, the ancient weapon cutting through dragon scales with ease. The battlefield was a blur of fire and blood, screams and roars. He could feel the heat of the flames on his skin, the weight of the air heavy with ash. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not now. The Dragon King appeared on the horizon, his massive form silhouetted against the fiery sky. Alan's breath caught in his throat as the beast descended, its wings blocking out the sun. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The final battle. The Dragon King landed with a thunderous crash, his eyes burning with hatred as he stared down at the humans who dared to defy him. Alan stepped forward, the ancient weapon gleaming in his hand. The Dragon King roared, a sound that shook the very earth, and charged. Alan met him head-on, the weapon slicing through the air as he leaped toward the beast. The clash was deafening, the force of their collision sending shockwaves through the battlefield. But Alan didn't falter. He struck again and again, each blow fueled by the memories of those he had lost, by the hope of a future where humanity could once again thrive. The Dragon King was powerful, more powerful than any dragon Alan had faced before. But he was not invincible. With a final, desperate strike, Alan drove the ancient weapon deep into the Dragon King's heart. The beast let out a final, anguished roar before collapsing to the ground, its massive body crumpling under its own weight. Silence fell over the battlefield. The dragons, seeing their king defeated, fled into the distance, their reign over humanity broken at last. Alan stood over the body of the Dragon King, chest heaving, the weapon still clutched tightly in his hand. Around him, the survivors began to gather, their faces filled with disbelief and awe. They had done it. The dragons were defeated, but the cost had been high. Many of their own had fallen, including Kara, who had sacrificed herself to save Alan during the battle. Her loss weighed heavily on him, but he knew that her sacrifice had not been in vain. They had won.as the sun finally broke through the clouds for the first time in years. Alan turned to face the survivors. "This is our time," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We rebuild. We survive. For those we've lost, and for the future we've earned." The survivors nodded, their faces solemn but filled with a new sense of hope. Together, they would rebuild their world. Together, they would forge a new future, one where humans no longer lived in fear. The ancient weapon, now dull and worn, was laid to rest in the center of the new human capital, a symbol of their resilience, their unity, and their triumph over the dragons. It would serve as a reminder to future generations of the price of freedom and the strength of the human spirit. And Alan, though forever marked by the battles he had fought, knew that his role was not yet finished. As long as there were threats to humanity, as long as there was a need for warriors, he would be there, ready to defend the last human stronghold.